So let me talk about the Lynching Memorial. The planning and the development of the memorial began in 2010 when the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, started to research and documenting thousands of racial terror lynchings that occurred in the United States between the Reconstruction and Civil Rights era. This research formed the base of the memorial's design and content. The EJI launched a fundraising campaign to support the construction of the memorial, and the memorial finally opened to the public in April 26, 2018. The structure has 800 Corten steel monuments to represent the counties in the U.S. where racial terror lynching took place, each engraved with its name of its victims. The EJI also partnered with the MASS design group who designed the home memorial to collect soils from sites where lynching was documented around the United States. The soil samples are displayed on the memorial site.
The AIDS quilt is a project that was started to memorialize those who passed from the AIDS pandemic. The AIDS pandemic itself was a crisis in which the HIV virus ran rampant due to public ignorance surrounding it and government action to address it being slow. The epidemic started in 1981 and reached its peak during that same decade. Although they weren't the only ones who got infected, the virus was most commonly associated with gay people. The AIDS quilt was started in 1985 by Cleve Jones during a planning event for a march in 1985. Jones asked other marchers at the event to write down the names of loved ones they lost to AIDS onto placards, which were then taped to the sides of the San Francisco Federal Building. Jones was inspired when seeing how the cards came together resembled a quilt, and the names project was officially formalized in 1987. People were invited to build quilt patches memorializing their lost family members, and these patches would be sewn into the quilt. The quilt itself doesn't really serve as a direct icon or index of something because it's made of parts that were each produced by different people with different goals in mind for what they were designing. In a sense, the quilt itself, and each of the patches it's made of, act as a symbol for the people who died in the AIDS pandemic. Each patch symbolizes a specific person, while the quilt itself symbolizes the class of people as a whole. Similarly, the quilt could possibly be said to be contour because of its artistry and lack of standardization. The main design principles it uses is rhythm due to the repetition of similar imagery such as names, and contrast because each patch is different from the other. Because it is two-dimensional, the quilt mainly uses the design elements of lines, shapes, color, and possibly texture.
So, the Lynching Memorial as a 3D monument uses proportion in its design. The reason of creating the hanging steel rectangle with a 6-foot human scale hanging from the ceiling of the memorial contain a symbolism that is really strong and straightforward. The whole structure uses metal and wood to create a sober atmosphere to the site. I would consider the Lynching Memorial a commercial design because it contains some sort of art elements on its design, but yet it's easy for the majority to understand and read when they visit the memorial.
Okay, so comparing and contrasting the quilt and lynching memorial from a design perspective, the main difference I see between the two of them is the quilt is, it's basically a composition of unique panels that each celebrate different people with different imagery respective to each panel. Each each panel is basically its own unique piece of art that's memorializing a separate person from each other. By contrast, the lynching memorial is a largely uniform series of suspended wooden signs listing the names of lynching victims. Each piece of the memorial that each person has their name written on looks the same as each other pretty much. So I would say that the lynching memorial itself is more sort of a memorial for lynching itself as like a hate crime, whereas the AIDS quilt is more of a memorial for the actual individual people who, passed away from it. Moving on, another difference that I saw between the two of them was in the way they utilize structures, structures as we discussed them in class. The quilt is a mainly a two-dimensional form of imagery, which is the quilt panels. Quilt, it's basically a flat image that has like designs sewn into it, but it doesn't have like actual depth. It's not like a, full object with different sides or different faces or anything. The lynching memorial, on the other hand, is a fully three-dimensional, it's a three-dimensional space that uses three-dimensional objects, the objects being the actual, lynching memorial placards, while the space itself is the building and the roofs that the placards hang from. So quilt, two-dimensional form of graphics, Lynch Memorial, three-dimensional form of graphics.
I would say both of the memorial provide a strong visual impact because of their size. The colorful and the design panels draw attention and evoke emotional responses, inviting the viewers to engage with the stories and experience it represented. But on the other hand, the lynching memorial's hanging metal panel represents the victim of racial terror lynching. The design of the memorial, with its rows of suspended columns, creates a haunting and somber atmosphere that encourages contemplations and reflection. But I agree that like both monuments have a huge impact on raising awareness on the issue which they both represent.
The reason why I chose these two specimens to do for the project is I find history very interesting, and I consider these two to be, their memorials and their historical testaments to two tragic, processes and crises that was inflicted on different groups of people. The AIDS quilt obviously was a memorial for all of the people who died in the AIDS pandemic, and the lynching memorial was a memorial to African Americans who were lynched to death in lynching hate crimes. And then would you like to echo your statement?
I would say both of the specimens serves one purpose, in my opinion. That's the most important is to like teach a lesson and spread the message of what happened in history, and we have to learn from it.
Yeah.